Use your graphite mechanical pencil to begin with, and we're going to create a long, skinny box. And we're going to put a square in the middle of the box, or a rectangle, and then we're going to divide the left half into 4 units, and we're going to divide the right, what's left over on the right, into 4 units. So we're going to end up with 9 units. It doesn't matter if they're exactly square. We're just trying to get 9 units going across. Then you're going to make a little X under the middle unit to remind yourself that we're not going to color that one in. We're not touching it. What we're trying to wrap our minds around is the idea of learning to draw on something that is already a middle value. Now, if you look around at the world, most of what you see is closer to a middle value than it is to white or black. So if you draw on paper that's already a middle value, your work is going to go much more quickly and easily. So everything to the right of this blank square is going to be at least a little lighter than our middle value. So our first step here is use your first shading direction. Remember, if you're right-handed, go the other way. And just lay in a very, very faint light tone over all 4 of those squares. Just a light first shading, barely touch it. And then we're going to do the same thing using your HB, the hard charcoal pencil. We're going to do a very light tone over the 4 squares on the left. And this is the first stage in any drawing that you do on toned paper, is to just carve up the world that you're trying to represent into 3 major zones. One zone is areas that are clearly in shadow, which is this. Another zone is areas that are clearly in light, which is this. And then the third zone is halftones, which are really in the middle between dark and light. And those we're never going to touch. We're never going to blend the black and the white charcoal together. Now we're going to finish the side on the left, and we're going to use a technique called cross-hatching, which you're probably familiar with. And let's very lightly do vertical shading now in these 3 boxes. And then we're going to do horizontal shading in the 2 on the left. And I'm starting to press a little harder. And then I'm going to go back to my first shading direction for that left-hand box, only I'm pressing even a little harder. And you can see the value scale is starting to take shape, but I don't have even steps yet. These 2 are kind of too close together. This is too big a jump, and these 2 are too close together. So I'm going to begin by pressing, actually, why don't you take out your 2B pencil and try a vertical shading in this box to get it just 1 step darker. Don't use your 2B pencil anywhere except this box on the left. And yes, we could get even darker with the 4B or the 6B, but we're just going to work down to 2B in this drawing. And now I'm assessing my steps again. Now this jump's a little too big, so I'm going to shade this one a little darker. And then I got to go a little darker on this one. And you want to stop when it looks like you have 3 even steps, but without outlines in between them. You see how this is reading like an outline? I don't want it to look like an outline, so I have to do a little more vertical shading away from that edge. And of course we are not smudging these, so don't start dragging your finger over the shading. And I gotta go just a little darker even on this first one. And what you're trying to achieve, and we could spend all day on this, but we're not going to. We're trying to achieve 5 even steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this difference and this difference and this difference and this difference are all about the same. I'm going to stop there. I think that's close enough. And then, as you probably guessed, we're going to do the same thing on the other side with white. So I'm going to start with a vertical shading all the way across. For these 3, I'll switch to horizontal for the last 2, pressing a little harder. And then I'm going to use vertical shading, pressing harder for the last one. And we want this to be pretty close to pure white. And this is the same procedure you'll follow in your drawings. You'll start out very timidly with very light pressure. Then you're going to establish your brightest brights and your darkest darks. And then you're going to make sure to refine your steps in between them, like this. And that's about all I'm going to do with this side. So that's just a rough, no, that's not good because these 2 are almost the same. So I've got to go a little brighter on this one. And that means even brighter on that one. And that's pretty good. Okay, you can go back to these later and adjust them, but I want to keep moving forward here, so I'm going to make a skinnier bar underneath, the same length as my value scale. Like that. And we're going to practice making a gradated value scale. Or, yeah, graded, graduated, I'm not even sure what. So we're going to start to make a nice even transition. We're only going to shade across. I'm going to shade from the dark towards the middle, and I'm going to try to match my values. This matches this. This matches this. This matches this, and in the middle is blank. And then we're going to do the same thing from the other side, pressing hard on the ends, and then just sweeping in towards the middle and creating that nice soft transition. And the most important thing here is that in the middle, your lines do not touch at all. You do not want your darks and your lights to be interweaving like this. They should be like pointing towards each other like this, but never touching. And I'm going to show you why you don't have to do this if you don't want, but underneath here, what happens if you very lightly do some white and then you do some black on top of it, is you create, you see how this really kind of sticks out? What I'm creating here is a gray that's not exactly the same as the gray of the paper. And so it just looks kind of ugly and like it doesn't belong there. You see how this gray is, the paper is kind of a warmer gray, and this is a mixed gray that's a little bit bluer, and it's really going to interfere with the beauty of the drawing. So we are never going to allow the black and white to mix together. If we're creating a sharp edge, the black and white can lie right side by side like that, but they cannot blend. Okay, so we're going to move down a little on the paper now, and we are going to draw this shape, and we're going to employ some of these ideas. So whenever I have to draw a symmetrical shape like this, the first thing I'm going to do is create a vertical axis of symmetry, and I'm going to do this more or less sight size just to make it easy on myself. And I'm going to use fractional thinking to get my proportions right. So I just created a vertical line like this, and if I was to measure, the center of this is okay, I'm going to mark the center, and what I just determined is the center is right about here. So this curve, this plane change is just above the center. This is about 1/3 of the way to this curve. You see that? Maybe a little less than 1/3, so I'm going to divide this roughly into thirds. So the ball on the top is going to be about this big. The curve is right here. I hope this is making sense to everyone the way I'm approaching this. If I go from the center to the bottom of this sphere and then the bottom of that curve, you see how these distances are about the same. So I know where this is. I know where the center line, my center mark is, and I go halfway. And that's how I establish the bottom of this curve. And then the final curve is here. So I just found a series of my main vertical landmarks. Now I'm going to be concerned with width. And I would say that the width of this knob on top is about exactly the same as its height. Can you see that? So that's helpful. I can just make an X here and block that in. I would say that this is about 2/3 of the way out from the center. See, that's about 2/3, 1/3. So let's go ahead and draw this knob. It's like a squared off circle. And then we're going to go about 2/3 of the way out on either side to create the neck. If I drop straight down from the outside of the knob, I come just inside the outside of these curves. So I know that this curve, which I already located, has to come out a little past here. And I'm going to think about this as an ellipse, because this actually turns the corner and comes back around. I'm pressing a little harder than I want you to press, because I need you to see my drawing, and it's on gray paper, so it's a little hard to it doesn't show up that well on the camera, so please use your lightest pressure. But if the drawing ends up reading too dark, you can also use a kneaded eraser to lighten it without erasing it. And that's what the kneaded erasers are really good for, is not eliminating lines, but lightening them and editing basically your darkness. So you see how if I just press this down over the thing I just drew, that's just making the lines fainter. If I move it back and forth, it's going to clean them up. So those are the two ways that you can use a kneaded eraser. You can also create a fine point on the eraser to do like kind of precision erasing if you want. Like that. I just noticed I'm a little smaller than sight size, so I'm going to click forward one notch. I'm going to resist the temptation to edit my drawing right now. I think it looks all right. This is about a circle, so I'm just going to try to sketch this as round. This outside prominence here is directly, it's the same size as the one on top. So if we make construction lines coming down, we've just located this. And all the steps and the thinking I'm using to draw this, understand these are all the same steps that you would use to draw a form like the human figure, which would be a lot more of an interesting challenge than this is. But before you tackle the figure, you really want to get to where a drawing like this is very easy to succeed at, because this form is an order of magnitude less complicated than a human figure. And the width of the base is the same as the width of the belly. So I'm going to drop two more construction lines down, and we're going to draw the base like this. One way to edit your work and think about being more accurate is look at the negative space created between this curve and an imaginary horizontal. You see that? You could even contemplate, like, what's this angle? You see how it's about 30 degrees? So you can draw that if you want. You see what I'm doing? So that's, most people are not going to have enough space left over inside this corner. So at least check that at this point. And the final stage before shading is shadow mapping, which we did last year, but we're going to do it very lightly. This curves down like that. This curves like that. This little wedge of shadow appears right here. And I'm going to come around in a minute to check your work, so you'll have a few more minutes to do your shadow mapping. I'm just doing it quickly so I can come around. Notice that this shadow, when it goes over this little ridge, takes a step down, then it goes almost straight across here, and then it curves around like that. And finally, the cast shadow. Here's how I'm going to think about this. The intersection of the top of the cast shadow is level with this point just below the apex of this curve, like that. The angle that the cast shadow is taking is about 25 degrees. And so I'm going to start here and sketch that angle like that. And the shape of the ellipse of this first shadow, which is the shadow of the belly of this thing, is really about the same size and shape as the bottom curve of the form. Can you see that? So we're going to go like that. A little higher than I had it. Hang on. And then we follow this line, and then there's another ellipse at the end. And notice these ellipses are horizontal ellipses. The axis of this ellipse is horizontal. Can everyone see that? It goes like straight across, and this one goes straight across. Just like this one. And that's what's going to make your shadow look like it's lying on the ground if you maintain the horizontal ellipses. And I'm going to call that good enough and pause for a minute to let you catch up with the construction steps. I know I was going pretty fast. Okay, here's the most important lesson from today. We are going to do a first shading using black and white. And only after we've done that, then we're going to do a reassessment of our shadow map. So remember, I'm left-handed. You're going to shade the other direction if you're right-handed. And this is one rare time when I'm not even looking at the subject matter. I'm just sort of coloring in very lightly all my shadow shapes. I'm going right up to the line. And remember, we don't stop and shade this and then this. We shade this whole shadow, cast shadow, form shadow. We treat it all as one big shadow shape. Now, this object was pretty easy to measure and to draw. And so this stage is not as critical for a simple object like this. If you're drawing a portrait, this stage becomes super critical because you are basically, what you're doing is you are giving your brain an opportunity to start to see this thing in 3 dimensions before you've committed to any of the drawing. So very lightly, I'm barely touching. This is my first step on my value scale. We're here and here only. And I'm going to very lightly fill in everything that gets hit with direct light is going to get a little bit of white. Now, my belief is that success at anything is a combination of skills and procedures. Let me talk for a moment about what this procedure is. what we're basically saying in this drawing is that we're drawing something that is gray, and we're drawing it on gray paper. Therefore, every part of the motif, everything in the photograph that is receiving direct light, has to be a little bit brighter than the paper, at least a little brighter. And everything in the motif that is not receiving direct light, in other words, everything we shadow mapped, is going to be by definition a little darker than the paper. And because we have a single light source and a gray object and gray paper, those rules are inviolable. Like, there's going to be no exceptions to those rules. So what you just saw me do is like a very quick approximation of the motif. I just wasn't thinking, and I located the horizon much lower than it is, so I'm going to move that. The horizon's actually up here. And notice that I'm going to say, even though the back wall is receiving a little bit of direct light, I'm not going to touch that. That's going to be my halftone. Okay. The next step before we do our assessment is erase the shadow map along, especially along these soft form shadow edges. And notice when I erase the shadow map, I'm also erasing a little bit of the shading, and I'm opening up a space between the dark and the light on these soft forms where I know I'm going to need some space, right? I'm basically creating this little void between the dark and the light so I can create that gradated transition. Even along here, I don't want that shadow map to be too abrupt. Even here, any place the shadow map is just sort of standing out and looking too visible, you can just lighten it with that kneaded eraser. So at this stage in the drawing, notice that the drawing has suddenly become legible to your brain as a three-dimensional form in a way that it was not before. So before, when you were critiquing your shadow map, you were comparing basically an abstract arrangement of lines to something that looks like a solid form. That's hard to do. It's hard to notice how those things are different because they're inherently different. Now we're comparing what looks like a solid form on the left to what looks like a solid form on the right, and any little errors in construction are going to be much more obvious to you. So this is the time, because you've never pressed hard on your paper yet, this is the time when it's very easy to make minor corrections. For example, I can see that the top of the knob here should be a little more squarish. So I'm going to just shape that with white charcoal very lightly and create a form that reads a little more like the form in the original. And you can do the same thing wherever you see big differences. You can basically change this form very easily at this stage. I'm also going to erase shadow map where both surfaces on both sides are light. because that's going to get in the way of my final effect. I don't want this shaded areas to look outlined. I can just use the kneaded eraser to press some of those lines away so they're not so prominent. And again, I'm doing that mainly where, like, I have a light background and a light form, so I don't want to have a dark line in between them. Okay. We are up to the final stage, which is the final shading, and now we can work just a little piece at a time. So even if you're not quite ready, we're going to zoom in and take a look at this form in more detail. And this is where you want to make sure your pencil's nice and sharp. I'm going to touch mine up. And for the first time, now that we're confident about placement, we can press a little harder. I'm pressing kind of hard through this cast shadow. And you're going to be amazed at how quickly this drawing comes together now. All the hard work is done. So a little darker under there. This is our core shadow, if you remember from learning how to draw spheres. So we're going to shade up into that, towards the light, across that boundary to create that rounded effect. And we're going to leave it just a little bit lighter inside here where the reflected light, where we find reflected light. And here's where, if you would look carefully, this is the primary skill for shading, is distinguishing shading direction as needed. So this is a very sharp edge, so notice I'm shading with the edge. This is a very soft edge, so I'm shading across the edge. If you can just learn those two moves and get used to them, your drawings are going to get so much better. This is a sharp edge, so I'm going to shade with the edge. And this is a soft edge, so I'm going to shade around the form like that. And it doesn't matter if you're lefty or righty now, this is all second shading, so it makes no difference. And while we're up here, we can take our white and add a few highlights. We have a brightening right through here. It's a very unfocused highlight because this is not a wet form, so it's not glossy, so it's going to be, see, the highlight is kind of diffuse. And we have just a little extra light on the very top plane too. And I'm going to just bleed in towards that shadow edge. And that form is already done. Could just do a little sharpening along here. I'm pressing very lightly, but I'm shading with that edge to sharpen it. I'm going to do the same thing with white down here. I'm shading with the edge to sharpen that edge. I'm not pressing too hard. Resist the temptation to press hard when you're on that outside contour, because that's not the brightest part. The light is actually focused a little bit in from that edge along here. And now I'm shading around the form, and my lines are extending towards the lines I made on the other side. And we're getting that nice cylindrical feel of that form. zoom out a little so we can see. And I'm going to resist the temptation also to press. I want to save my brightest white, not for here, but I see a brighter light happening on this inside corner. So I want to save that. That's the only place I'm going to go pretty close to like pure white. And we create that just by using the white but pressing a lot harder. And this is really so satisfying when you get the hang of these techniques, and you can just create these very solid looking little forms, especially when you start drawing things like people where, you know, the final effect is a lot more impressive and expressive. And just keep focusing on what kind of edge am I seeing. And if it's soft, you shade perpendicular to the edge. If it's sharp, you shade parallel to the edge. And if it's in between, you can shade. Some people, you can do it either way, but you just want to like create that in between effect. Now, most people are going to look at something like this curve here and believe that the whole thing's in shadow. But notice the shadow ends right here. So as we come around this curve, we're going to shade only to about here with black, and then we're going to stop. And we're going to connect that with this outside skinny little form shadow, or that's a little cast shadow there. It turns into a larger form shadow underneath. So you may be wondering, like, well, what about this side? Don't we need to darken that? But that's not in shadow, so we're not allowed to put black over here. What we have to do instead is just use white above it, like that, and white, a little white below it, and you see what happened? We're just using the gray of the paper to create that dark. And that's something that takes a little practice to get good at, but especially if you're not used to working on white paper at all, but very, very important technique to learn. So we have like 8 minutes, so I'm going to hurry, but this is all going to be recorded, so you can finish at your leisure next time. I'm going to pass a first shading over the whole belly of this form. I mean, I already did, but I'm pumping it up just a little. And then I'm going to go a step brighter on the highlight here. And again, the lightest light is not at the very edge of the form. It's going to be usually, unless the form is backlit, it's going to be in from the edge. And this knob is going to be the same as the upper one. Basically, we're going to shade around the corner towards the gray like this. And we're trying to leave that little hint of reflected light inside here. Then it gets dark again under here. This cast shadow is a lot darker than that reflected light. One sign of sophistication in drawing is you do not want to impose more. You don't want to differentiate between values in your drawing that are not differentiated in nature. So you see how this value and this value are the same. So I'm gonna let these shadows kind of blend together. You'll remember that when we drew the baby head, like a lot of the forms just blended together. The beginner wants to make a hard outline here. Like they want to bring out that form change a lot more than they see it in the photograph. That would be a mistake. There's that principle that we've talked about of object completion, where if your brain sees this sharp outline here and it sees this sharp outline here, your brain is going to fill in the rest of the outline, and the brain of the viewer of your drawing is going to do the same thing. So you don't really need to worry about that. Horizontal, to make this shadow lie down even more than it already is. Want it to lie flat on the ground for us, like that. Whoops, you can't see that at all. Sorry. Let me zoom out. So this is how you keep the shadow lying down. Horizontal with black and a little horizontal with white. Here the white, we can do sharpening strokes to bring out this curve very subtly. We do not want to press hard when we do stuff like this. We don't want to make it look outlined. We're just trying to bring out some things exactly to the degree that we see them brought out in real life. And then we always transition from the sharpening strokes into horizontal strokes like that. And a step lighter on this up plane. Again, we've got this little shelf to bring out by shading on either side of it with white. A little highlight here. And a little fine tuning because this is reading a little too dark to me. So take my kneaded eraser, and instead of making that so dark, I'm just going to do some sharpening strokes behind it to make that edge come out a little better. Okay, that's all we have time for today. I'm going to call this lesson done. Please take your time to finish these drawings next time, and if you're at home, understand that you'll need these materials to do the drawings, but I will expect them to get done. Thank you very much.